Hey guys, welcome back to Read Aloud. We're in Peter Pan by J.M. Barrie, and the Lost Boys have just made Wendy a house, and we'll find out what happens when they knock on the door. Now, really and truly, it was finished. Nothing remained to do but to knock. "Oh, look your best," Peter warned them. "First impressions are awfully important." Wonder where he heard that. He was glad no one asked him what first impressions are. They were all too busy looking their best. So he doesn't even really know what it means. He knocked politely. And now the wood was as still as the children. Not a sound to be heard from Tinker Bell, who was watching from a branch and openly sneering. What the boys were wondering was, would anyone answer the knock? If a lady, what would she be like? The door opened, and a lady came out. It was Wendy. They all whipped off their hats. She looked properly surprised, and this was just how they hoped she would look. "Where am I?" she said. Of course, Slightly was the first to get his word in. "Wendy, lady," he said rapidly, "for you we built this house." "Oh, say you're pleased," cried Nibs. "Lovely, darling house," Wendy said. And they were the words they hoped she would say. "And we are your children," cried the twins. Then they all went on their knees, holding out their arms, and cried, "Oh, Wendy lady, be our mother." "Ought I?" Wendy said, all shining. "Of course, it's frightfully fascinating. But you see, I'm only a little girl. I have no real experience." "That doesn't matter," said Peter, as if he were the only person present who knew all about it, though he was really the one who knew the least. "What we need is just a nice motherly person." "Oh dear," Wendy said. "You see, I feel that is exactly what I am." It is, they all cried. "We saw it at once." "Very well," she said. "I will do my best. Come inside at once, you naughty children. I'm sure your feet are damp. And before I put you to bed, I have just enough time to finish the story of Cinderella." In they went. I don't know how there was room for them, but you can squeeze very tight in Neverland. And that was the first of many joyous evenings they had with Wendy. By and by, she tucked them up in the great bed in the home under the trees. But she herself slept that night in the little house, and Peter kept watch with a drawn sword, for the pirates could be heard carousing far away, and the wolves were on the prowl. The little house looked so cozy and safe in the darkness, with a bright light showing through its blinds, and the chimney smoking beautifully, and Peter standing on guard. After a time, he fell asleep, and some fairies had to climb over him on their way home from a party. Any of the other boys obstructing the fairy path at night, they would have mischieved. But they just tweaked Peter's nose and passed on. So here's the house. And here's Peter asleep and the fairies walking home. There's the tree. Chapter 7, The Home Under the Ground. One of the first things Peter did the next day was to measure Wendy and John and Michael for hollow trees. Hook, you remember, had sneered at the boys for thinking they needed a tree apiece, but this was ignorance, for unless your tree fitted you, It was difficult to go up and down, and no two of the boys were quite the same size. It was like magic. Once you fitted, you drew in your breath at the top, and down you went at exactly the right speed. While to ascend, you drew in and let out alternately, and so wriggled up. Of course, and of course, when you've mastered the action, you're able to do those things without thinking of them. And nothing can be more graceful. But you simply must fit. And Peter measures you for your tree as carefully as for a suit of clothes. The only difference being that the clothes are made to fit you, while you have to be made to fit the tree. Usually it's done quite easily, as by wearing too many garments or too few. But if you're bumpy in awkward places, or the only available tree is an odd shape, Peter does some things to you, and after that, you fit. Once you fit, great care must be taken to go on fitting, and this, as Wendy was to discover to her delight, keeps the whole family in perfect condition. Wendy and Michael fitted their trees at the first try, but John had to be altered a little. After a few days' practice, they could all go up and down as gaily as buckets in a well, and how ardently they grew to love their home under the ground, especially Wendy. It consisted of one large room, as all houses should do, with a floor in which you could dig if you wanted to go fishing. And in this floor grew stout mushrooms of charming color, which were used as stools. Another tree tried hard to grow in the center of the room, but every morning they sawed the trunk through, level with the floor. But by tea time, it was always about 2 feet high, and then they put their door on top of it, and thus the whole thing became a table. As soon as they cleared away, they sawed the trunk again, and there was more room to play. There was an enormous fireplace, which was in almost any part of the room where you cared to light it, and across this Wendy stretched strings made of fiber, from which she suspended her washing. She had a clothesline. The bed was tilted against the wall by day and let down at 6:30, when it filled nearly half the room, and all the boys except Michael slept in it, lying like sardines in a tin. There was a strict rule against turning round till one gave the signal, when all turned at once. How did they sleep like that? Michael should have used it also, but Wendy had to have a baby, and he was the littlest. And you know how women are, and the short and the long of it is that he was hung up in a basket. Not all women are that way. But she wanted to have a little baby to play with, a little doll baby. It was rough and simple, and not unlike what baby bears would have made of an underground house in the same circumstances. But there was one recess in the wall, no larger than a bird cage, which was the private apartment of Tinkerbell. It could have been shut off from the rest of the home by a tiny curtain, which Tink, who was most fastidious, always kept drawn when dressing or undressing. No woman, however large, could have had a more exquisite boudoir and bedchamber combined. The couch with its club legs, and she varied the bedspreads according to what fruit blossom was in season. Her mare, of which there are now only 3 unchipped, was known to the fairy dealers. She had like fancy fairy antiques. The washstand was pie crust, so it has that little edging on it, and reversible. And the chest of drawers, and the carpets, and the rugs were from the best period. There was a chandelier for the look of it, but of course she lit the residence herself. Tink was very, contemptuous of the rest of the house, as was indeed perhaps inevitable, and her chamber, though beautiful, looked rather conceited, having the appearance of a nose permanently turned up. I suppose it was all especially entrancing to Wendy because those rampageous boys of hers gave her so much to do. Really, there were whole weeks when, except perhaps with a stocking in the evening, she was never above ground. The cooking, I can tell you, kept her nose to the pot. Their chief food was roasted breadfruit, yams, coconuts, baked pig, apples, topperolls, and bananas, washed down with calabashes of popo. But you never knew exactly if there would be a real meal or just make-believe. It all depended on Peter's whim. He could eat, really eat, if it was part of a game, but he could not stodge just to feel stodgy, which is what most children like better than anything else. The next best thing being able to talk about it, so he wouldn't get all stuffed unless he felt like it. Make-believe was so real to him that during a meal of it, you could see him getting fatter. Of course, it was trying, but you simply had to follow his lead. And if you could prove to him that you were getting loose for your tree, he let you stodge. So if you told him, "Oh, I'm getting too thin for my tree," he'd let you eat. Wendy's favorite time for sewing and darning was after all had gone to bed. Then, as she expressed it, she had a breathing time for herself, and she occupied it making new things for them and putting double pieces on the knees, for they were all most frightfully hard on their knees. So is she really getting time for herself? No. When she sat down to a basketful of their stockings, every heel with a hole in it, she would fling up her arms and exclaim, "Oh dear, I am sure sometimes I think that spinsters are to be envied." Spinsters. Other spinsters are women who never get married. It's not a very kind name for them. Her face beamed when she exclaimed this, so she's just joking and playing. "You remember about her pet wolf? Well, it very soon discovered that she had come to the island and found her out, and they just ran into each other's arms. And after that, it followed her about everywhere." So she had her little pet wolf with her, though. As time wore on, did she think much about the beloved parents she had left behind her? Remember her poor parents crying on the bed in Nana? This is a difficult question, because it is quite impossible to say how time does wear on in Neverland, where it's calculated by moons and suns, and there are ever so many more of them than on the mainland. But I'm afraid that Wendy did not really worry about her father and mother. She was absolutely confident they would always keep the window open for them, and she could just fly back with complete ease of mind. What disturbed her at times was that John remembered his parents vaguely only as people he had once known, while Michael was quite willing to believe that she was his real mother. These things scared her a little, and nobly anxious to do her duty, she tried to fix the old life in their minds by setting them up examination papers on it, as like as possible to the ones she used to do at school. The other boys thought this awfully interesting and insisted on joining, and they made slates for themselves and sat round the table writing and thinking hard about the questions she'd written on another slate and passed around. So she wrote the questions on one slate, like a whiteboard, but it was actually a piece of slate that she would write on and then pass it around so they could see the questions. They were the most ordinary questions. What was the color of Mother's eyes? Which was taller, father or mother? Was Mother a blonde or a brunette? Answer all three questions, if possible. A. Write an essay of not less than 40 words on how I spent my last holidays, or the characters of father and mother compared. Only one of these need be attempted. Or, number 1, describe mother's laugh. Number 2, describe father's laugh. Number 3, describe mother's party dress. Number 4, describe the kennel and its inmate. Who is she talking about there? Nana. They were just everyday questions like these, and when you could not get an answer, you were told to make a cross, so like an X. And it was really dreadful what number of crosses even John made. Of course, the only boy who replied to every question was Slightly, and no one could have been more hopeful of coming out first. But his answers were perfectly ridiculous, and really came out last. A melancholy thing. Peter did not compete. For one thing, he despised all mothers, except for Wendy. And for another, he was the only boy on the island who could neither write nor spell, not the smallest word. He was above that sort of thing. So I guess he didn't mind if they did, though, even though he didn't like them to know things he didn't know. I guess he acted like he was above it. He didn't care if he knew it or not. So if they wanted to do it, whatever. By the way, the questions were all written in the past tense. What was the color of Mother's eyes, and so on. Wendy, you see, had been forgetting too. I wonder what will happen. They're forgetting their parents, their poor parents who are so desperate for them to come back. And they're not even thinking about it. They're forgetting about them. How do you think their parents would feel if they knew that? They're just off having fun, careless, not thinking, blithely. Well, we'll have to see what happens next. Some adventures coming up next. See you then. Bye, guys.